One of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it's caused us to rethink the foundations of our society, how our health is managed, our shelter, our homes, as well as our food. And when it comes to food, I want to talk about a radical idea today. What if our food could be free? What if the way in which we feed ourselves was radically transformed so that the cost of food was as close to zero as possible, so that not only could we feed ourselves quite easily and cheaply, but what if we could end hunger as we know it, not just in our lifetimes, but as we end the pandemic in the near future? Now, this is something I've been thinking about throughout the pandemic as I've been spending time here on my farm in Eastern Ontario, because I've been learning more about two revolutions currently taking place in agriculture. One is the revolution in regenerative agriculture, or agroecology, in which we recognize that it's easier to work with nature rather than to try to control it. Rather than try to force the land to grow what we want, instead let's work with the land and grow in abundance and be able to grow with such bounty that we have surpluses that in and of themselves make food as cheap or near to free as possible. But what if we made it so easy for anybody to farm and made farming as an industry or as a sector as accessible as possible? Well, that's partly a result of the second revolution in agriculture, which is the revolution in robotics. All of a sudden, robots and artificial intelligence are making such tremendous inroads that the idea of having robots on the farm, tending to crops, planting, harvesting, doing all the work that, quite honestly, a lot of humans don't really want to do, that's another key towards making food as cheap or even free. Now, these robots are called Dino, and they're produced by a French company called Neo Technologies, and they use artificial intelligence to go across a farmer's field and identify weeds using image recognition. But then what they also represent is a dramatic expansion of sustainability practices in farming. What Neo is proposing is essentially eliminating all chemical pesticides and instead using little blades that once they identify a weed, just cut the weed right out of the ground. So this is an example of agricultural robotics not just lowering labor costs, but changing farming practices as a whole, making organic farming practices as accessible as possible. Because nowadays, when you go to the store, if you see the organic section, that's the expensive stuff. Well, what if it was the other way around? What if the organic food was actually cheap, if not free? And thanks to robots, that's actually starting to become possible. Because it's not just Neo. I mean, here's another example. This is from Pixel Farming Robotics, and this is another automatic weeder that doesn't require pesticides, except in this case, it's got solar panels located on the roof. So that way it's not only able to harness the energy of the sun in order to power it, but if it's got enough batteries, it can actually go 24/7. So again, this acknowledges some of the limits of labor, because here's another open secret within the agricultural sector. They've got a huge labor shortage. Because nobody wants to be a farmhand. Nobody actually wants to work on a farm and do the heavy labor, especially the monotonous and repetitive tasks. And farmers have such tight economic models. It's so difficult for them to make a living that they can't even afford to pay people minimum wage. In fact, the open scandal amidst the pandemic in Canada has been the plight of migrant farm workers. These are people who come from other parts of the world to work in Canada for far less than minimum wage, and during the pandemic be housed in terrible barracks that caused them to all get COVID and have terrible complications. So why would we protect those jobs? I mean, wouldn't it make sense for robots to perform those functions? I mean, it certainly allows the workers to do more creative tasks, frees up the farmer to think about their larger business. But if we could eliminate the labor costs, if we could subsidize these robots and have them as free or as accessible as possible, wouldn't that allow our food production system? Wouldn't that allow farmers to have more healthier businesses? Now, the robots I've shown you so far are still relatively large in terms of the way in which we think of farm equipment and machinery. But here's a business out of Britain called Small Robot Company. And Small Robot Company actually builds smaller robots that are designed to work in tandem. and essentially apply the same organic principles. In this case, this is their medium-sized robot that does similar weeding, but to also have tiny robots that can do seeding and harvesting. That way have an entire fleet of them that's able to go and maintain the crops in a much more sustainable, much more accessible way. But I should also mention that the easiest way to get free food is, of course, to grow it yourself. And that's where the Romy project, currently funded by the European Union, is designed to create even smaller robots, designed not just for farmers, but for gardeners. So that if you've got raised beds in your backyard, maybe even you've got a little greenhouse in your condo, there's ways in which automation can actually allow your green thumb to evolve to be part of agriculture. I mean, for example, think of all the times in which you forgot to water a houseplant or, saw the squirrels going after the vegetables in the garden. Well, in this case, you could use a robot to make sure that the moisture levels are always at an ideal rate to remove any weeds. And if you put it in an enclosed environment, or maybe even give the robot its own little laser gun, as we saw, you could keep those squirrels away. Although I should point out that regenerative agricultural practices suggest that if you grow enough food, the squirrels can have some and you can have some too, and everyone will be happy. But that kind of brings me to the issue of the food supply chain. Because the other aspect which automation can have a huge impact on the way in which we buy and consume food is by changing the way in which that food goes from the farm to our table. Now, on the one hand, that includes self-driving vehicles and delivery drones and the way in which robots can literally shorten the distance between the farm and whether it's the store or whether it's our table. But what if the supply chain itself was transparent? What if you could, let's say, organize your fellow condo dwellers to raise tomatoes on your balconies or set up automated greenhouses in your apartments? And then what if you produce so many tomatoes that you decided to make them available to a nearby restaurant? Well, that's where a supply chain and being transparent in making these types of connections easier could allow for more responsiveness, allow for this food to be diverted. Because earlier in the pandemic, we saw this with potatoes. Farmers who were growing potatoes all of a sudden lost their customers who were restaurants, who had shifted from in-house dining to takeout. So if only those potatoes could have gotten to you or I, if only there was a bulletin board or a social media platform in which we could literally see that open supply chain. And that's where it's also worth thinking about restaurants themselves as one of the final stops in that food supply chain. Because as we know, they're kind of up against the ropes when it comes to maintaining their business. So what if food was free? What if food was priced at such a low commodity price that when restaurants charged for food, they're not charging for the cost of their supplies, they're charging for their labor. They're charging for the chef, they're charging for the server, they're charging for the rent for their restaurant. Because that's where really the optimal opportunity here when it comes to making food free is not in destroying industries, but reviving them. Because let's bring it back to the farmer. I mean, did you know, for example, that it's almost impossible for farmers to make a living? I mean, here in Canada, for example, we subsidize dairy farmers. Well, in Eastern Ontario, most farmers are just part-time because they have to have day jobs in order to support their business. And all around the world, in order for farmers to make a living, they depend upon government subsidies. Certainly that's true in India, where right now we're seeing massive protests, in part because the government is threatening to remove those subsidies. But what if the answer was not in removing the subsidies, but increasing them? What if we found a way to subsidize agricultural robotics, subsidize what farmers do, and basically make it easy for people to farm? Not so that we're trying to make farmers rich, but in order to make food free. Because that, while being a radical idea, is something that we can look forward to. That the combination of robots and new farming practices can not only make safer and healthier food, but could make food in such great abundance that we could literally give it away for free. Granted, we still got to subsidize farmers so that they would go through the trouble of raising it, but that would actually be far cheaper than what we currently spend on propping up what I think is a broken food system. So how about that as a nice thought to think of in the future? We can have our food for free if we invest in robots and subsidize farmers. Thank you very much.